This is the new 2020 Mercedes-Benz GLB, and it's the newest Mercedes crossover. The GLB is the new entry-level family Mercedes SUV. It offers 3-row seating and affordable pricing, at least relative to some other Mercedes-Benz SUVs. Today, I'm going to review the GLB and let you know if it's worth considering. I've borrowed this 2020 GLB from Fletcher Jones Motorcars, which is an excellent Mercedes-Benz dealership here in Newport Beach, California. Fletcher Jones sells more Mercedes-Benz than any other dealership in the United States, and they have all of the latest models, including the new GLB, which has just started to go on sale. So let's talk GLB. Believe it or not, this is Mercedes' 8th SUV or crossover, so you wouldn't necessarily think there's room in the lineup for another one. But while the GLA is Mercedes-Benz entry-level crossover with a starting price of around $35,000, the GLB is Mercedes' entry-level family crossover with a starting price of around $37,000 and available third-row seating. Yes, that's right. This is a compact Mercedes-Benz crossover with 3-row seating. It's sort of a baby version of the Mercedes GLE, which is their midsize SUV, and a really baby version of the GLS, which is their larger SUV. Right now, the GLB comes in only one version, the GLB250, which uses a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder that makes about 220 horsepower. You can get it in front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Like I said, prices start around $37,000, but this GLB is well equipped with a 3rd-row seat and a few other options, bringing its sticker price to around $45,000. And today I'm going to review the GLB and show you what you get with Mercedes' new baby family crossover. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the GLB and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the GLB with probably its most notable feature, and that would be the 3rd-row seat. Now, the 3rd row is optional in the GLB. It costs $850 extra, so you don't have to get it. But it's a big distinctive feature compared to the smaller GLA and the larger GLC, neither of which offer the 3rd row. So let's talk 3rd row. To get back here, you pull this little latch on the side of the 2nd-row seat, and then the seat back folds forward and the seat itself slides forward to give you more room to enter the 3rd row. Now that's helpful, but as you can see, there's still not all that much room to climb into the 3rd row. This is a very small vehicle to offer 3-row seating, and so getting back here is going to be a challenge. Now I have folded the 2nd-row seat back forward and slid the seat as far forward as it will go. Let's see how difficult it is for me in the 3rd row of the GLB. Oh, whew. Well, climbing in isn't especially easy. It's more folding yourself in and then kind of flopping down, but it is worth noting that I did make it in back here. But that's about the only credit I'm willing to give the 3rd row, at least in terms of seating room back here, because it is incredibly tight in this 3rd row. Very, very little room. This is what happens when you put a 3rd row in a vehicle this small. You do not want to be back here if you're an adult, even for a very short trip. This 3rd row is really only for kids. And in fact, Mercedes-Benz drives that point home. In the door jamb of the rear doors, there's a warning label that specifically says the 3rd row is limited to people who are 66.5 inches or less in height. That translates to 5'6". So this 3rd row is really only intended for smaller adults and children. That's typically true of 3rd rows, but in this case, it's actually policed by a warning label: do not put adults back here. With that said, I am kind of surprised by the amenities back here for such a tiny third row that will only get used when it's absolutely necessary. For instance, there are cup holders back here, and 2 of them. I get into a lot of 3-row vehicles with larger third rows than this, and there are no cup holders. The GLB has them. And more impressive, in this little storage cubby next to the seat, you have a USB-C port, and you have that on both the driver's side and on the passenger side, there's a second one. So tiny little third row passengers can charge their devices, both of them at the same time in the third row. Again, pretty impressive considering this third row will likely only be used in a pinch. And next we move on to the second row in the GLB, and I have to say, it is impressively spacious back here. I have a lot of room. I'm sitting here and my knees don't even come close to touching the front passenger seat, which is in a reasonable seating position. There's a lot of space for a compact crossover, but only when the second row seat is slid all the way back. And when you do that, you eliminate all the legroom from the third row seat. So you have to make a choice. You can either have a spacious second row and no legroom for the third row, or you can move the second row forward and then you have a cramped second row and, well, frankly, a cramped third row also. But that's the only reasonable way to have third row passengers in here, is if the second row passengers are uncomfortable. But if there's nobody in the third row, slide your seat back and you enjoy a lot more space than you'd get from most other compact crossovers. And next up, another interesting second row item. This is clearly intended to be a family SUV, and I say that because drop down this little compartment behind the front center storage area and you have 2 more USB-C chargers, and you also have a household style power outlet there. So you have 2 USB-Cs in the third row, 2 more in the second row, plus that household outlet. Very good for charging devices and all the other stuff your kids might want to be doing. And one other item worth noting back here, you also have climate vents. These again come through the front center console to the back seats. You don't have your own climate controls back here, not at this price point, but climate vents is better than what you'd get in some other compact crossovers where rear passengers just have to make do with whatever air is coming out in the front. And next up we move on to the cargo area in the GLB. You open up the tailgate and you can see that this is one of the most laughably tiny cargo areas you will ever see in any vehicle, SUV, sports car, anything. You have no space back here, room for a couple of soft bags, and that's about it. But there's good news. If you don't have anyone in the third row seats, dropping the third row for more cargo room is insanely easy. Just pull on this little red loop, the seat goes down. Then do the same thing over on the other side. Pull on the red loop, seat goes down, and suddenly you have a flat cargo floor. And now you have a surprisingly large cargo floor. Because this cargo area was designed to be able to accommodate actual human people, when you use it for cargo, it ends up becoming one of the largest cargo areas in the compact crossover world. And so there's a lot of space back here if the third row isn't in use. And another great thing about the cargo area, if you want the seats to come back up because you want to put people in the third row, it is just as easy. You just grab onto this black loop and then you can pull the seat back up and it pops right back into place. Do the same thing over on the other side, grab the black loop, pull the seat back up, and boom, you have a third row again in like 8 seconds. Now, this isn't as easy as in some ultra luxury SUVs where you just push a button and the seats fold down automatically, but it is simpler and less likely to break, and frankly, it's quicker. Just pulling that loop, the seat flops down, as opposed to waiting for the electronic mechanism to lower the seat down. And next up, another interesting item with the GLB is certainly its styling, because it's kind of boxy. In the days when everybody else is going to swoopier looking SUVs, this one has a more boxy upright shape, certainly more than the GLA and the GLC, which is close to in price and size. Some reviewers have even tried to draw comparisons between the GLB and its boxy styling and the G-Wagon. They've called the GLB like a baby G-Wagon. To me, those comparisons are mostly clickbait. There's nothing G-Wagon about this low ground clearance, 4-cylinder, front wheel drive drive compact crossover, and instead I think it's kind of more of a scaled down GLE or GLS in terms of styling. One other item worth noting about the boxy shape, I suspect the reason that it's so squared off in back is to preserve headroom for that third row seat. They needed the roofline to kind of stay flat for as long as possible in order to be able to actually fit rear passengers in there. And so that's why the roofline stays flat in the back of the GLB, and it looks boxier than most other crossovers compared to the latest trend of kind of a more curvy design. And next we move on to the front seat in the GLB, where that boxy kind of tough theme is carried on up here. For example, take a look at the grab handles in the door panel. It has this tough aluminum look. You pull it closed, it looks like what you'd expect to find in a full-size pickup truck. Same deal on the dashboard. That tough looking aluminum piece carries over to the passenger side of the dashboard, and you just have a more upright dash. You can see the style doesn't like flow into the door panels like in so many other cars. Instead, it kind of has a more upright look and feel to make it seem like you're in more of a higher riding vehicle. Next up, perhaps not surprisingly, there's more USB-C ports up here for charging. Inside the front center console, you open it up and you can see 2 more USB-C ports. And in the center console itself, there's another USB-C port. That one is to link up your device with the infotainment system, but it is indeed another port. So there are 7 total USB-C ports in the GLB. That's quite a bit for a relatively small vehicle like this. And next up, to me, one of the very first things you notice when you climb inside the GLB is that the materials are all really nice for the price point. Everything in here looks good. This interior is a lot better than you'd expect for a vehicle that starts around $37,000. For instance, the dashboard with this aluminum trim, from the starter button to the climate vents to this piece over on the passenger side, all looks really, really nice. In the center control stack, this group of buttons and switches also all looks really nice, far better than the plastic buttons Mercedes-Benz used to use only a few years ago. These high quality buttons and switches are even in relatively inexpensive models like the GLB, and it's the same deal with the steering wheel, also very nice looking, a lot higher quality than Mercedes-Benz wheels from just a few years ago that used way too much plastic. This is a huge improvement, again, especially at this price point. With that said, even though the interior materials present a pretty good value for the price point, there are some things this interior is missing. For example, this GLB doesn't have a sunroof. For $45,000. You would expect to have a sunroof, but you don't get one here. Another thing I don't like about some of the entry-level Mercedes-Benz models is the stalks coming off the steering column. The turn signal wiper stalk on the left looks cheap. It's all plastic, not very nice. Same deal with the gear selector coming off on the right. Again, looks cheap, plastic, small, not all that nice. These are things you touch fairly frequently, and you would think touch points like this would be nicer materials, but in a lot of the newer entry-level Mercedes models, that's not the case. Another missing item in this GLB is navigation. This one doesn't have a navigation system, even though it has this really modern, futuristic Mercedes-Benz infotainment technology. There's no nav. Now, strangely enough, there's still a button for the navigation system in the center console. You can see it says Navi Map, but when you press it, it doesn't do anything. Very strange. You can see when I press the radio button, it instantly pulls up the radio, but when you press Navi Map, nothing happens in the screen. Most of these modern Mercedes-Benz infotainment systems are ordered with the navigation system, so when you don't have it, I guess it's easier to just leave the button in anyway, even though it does nothing. Now, speaking of that infotainment system, this is the new MBUX system that's making its way into various different Mercedes-Benz models. I've already reviewed this system in many other Mercedes models, and I'll link a few of those reviews in the description below, so I'm not going to get too in-depth. But my very favorite part of MBUX is how controllable it is. Some automakers let you have a touchscreen, others let you have a little pad in the center console to control it, others give you steering wheel controls. In here, you have all of that, and you can choose what's best. So you want a touchscreen? This is a touchscreen, and you can see it's tremendously responsive to your touch. Excellent, just like a smartphone. You want to control it with a pad? Fine, there is a pad in the center. You can move your fingers around, control the system that way, and again, very responsive, very easy. If you'd prefer to control it on the steering wheel, once again, you can do that. Just move your fingers around and you can control the infotainment system. I love the fact that you have options and you're not forced into one thing, because some people like a touchscreen, some like steering wheel controls. Here, you have it all. And speaking of technology, I also love the gauge cluster screen behind the steering wheel, mostly for its configurability. You can see here, you move your finger on this little pad on the steering wheel and you can configure every different aspect of the gauge cluster screen. It's really impressive. Again, I've gotten into more details about this in other reviews of new Mercedes-Benz models, and I don't want to be repetitive, but this is really impressive that you can basically configure your gauge cluster to show you whatever is most important to you at that given moment. By the way, speaking of the gauge cluster, one quirk that I like in there is one of the screens that it's supposed to show you is your navigation screen, your map, where you are right now. But like I said, this car doesn't have navigation. So when you get to that screen in the gauge cluster, it just shows a map of the world and you're located somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Just a reminder that you don't have navigation. This is like the screen equivalent of a blank button or switch for a feature you didn't get. It's kind of funny to see it there. You'd think they'd just update the software to not even have that screen, but instead it has it, and it's not particularly helpful. And finally, a few other interior quirks and features. In the center console, there is a switch marked dynamic. If you move that switch, it will cycle through your drive modes. The interesting quirk is that if you go into sport mode, it specifically says don't do this with a roof load, as if this car is going to get so sporty and aggressive and exciting when you switch into sport mode that it could mess things up if you have a roof load. It's just laughable. I almost think they put it in there to make sport mode seem sportier than it is. Next up, another item I like in here is the cup holders. You can see the cup holders are a certain size, but if you need the cup holders to be smaller to accommodate a smaller cup, you go down to this play button, which is actually an arrow pointing to the cup holder. You press it, and then like a cup holder pops out instantly. You can do the same thing on the other side, and then it will accommodate smaller cups. Next up, another interior quirk I like in the center console is the wireless charging pad. Having a wireless charging pad, not all that unusual, but I like the fact that when you put your phone down, you can pull out this little arm that will then keep your phone in place. So you go over a bump or you get in an accident, your phone won't go flying. That little arm is actually a pretty good idea. And next up, let's talk taillights. You can see the look of these taillights is very distinctive, sort of these oddly shaped trapezoids lit up within the taillight housing. This is intended to match all of the other modern Mercedes-Benz crossovers. You'll see similar taillight designs in the GLS, the new GLE, and now the GLB. It's a very distinctive look, and it keeps all the Mercedes-Benz models in the same family. And next up, we move under the hood in the GLB. Nothing particularly interesting to mention here, but it's still worth covering. This is the same 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder that Mercedes-Benz uses in most of their entry-level models, and just like in a lot of the others, here it makes about 220 horsepower. Nothing particularly quirky or interesting or weird with this engine, and like I mentioned, the GLB is offered with either front-wheel drive, like this one, or all-wheel drive if you want a little more traction for snow or rough roads or that sort of thing. And so those are the quirks and features of the new 2020 Mercedes-Benz GLB. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the GLB, the 8th Mercedes-Benz SUV. Pretty wild. I also have mixed feelings about the idea of the GLB. A 3-row crossover this size seems like an odd decision, but Mercedes-Benz has their hand in basically every other pot, so why not do this one too? And I actually think it makes some sense. There are some families who want a Mercedes crossover, who want the 3rd row, for occasional use, and the GLE is just too expensive. And so this car gives you the opportunity to have 3-row seating without spending a fortune. On this particular GLB, the 3rd row is a standalone option for only $850. So theoretically, you could configure one of these without many options to around 40 grand and have the 3rd row seat, which is pretty good for a Mercedes-Benz with all of the latest technology and considering how nice this interior is. As for how this thing drives, some pros and cons. The steering and handling, not particularly inspiring or interesting. It just sort of drives like a crossover, basically. Acceleration and power is impressive though. I like this engine. I've liked it in all the other vehicles that use it, the CLA250, and it's a nice responsive powertrain with a good transmission. And so this actually feels relatively quick for like an entry-level family crossover. And to me, one of the real selling points here is the interior. It used to be that if you got an entry-level Mercedes-Benz, you got a terrible interior. This was even true on entry-level like E-classes. But now, even on the cheapest models, the interior is nice. They have nice finishers, nice trim, finally kind of fitting the Mercedes-Benz name, even if you don't spend what has traditionally been regarded as Mercedes-Benz money. The seating is comfortable, the driving experience is comfortable. This car is certainly quieter and more comfortable and more supple than a traditional compact crossover, like a Ford Escape or a Nissan Rogue or a RAV4. It's definitely a step up from those vehicles in terms of materials, comfort, acceleration, technology, that sort of thing. So to me, it does justify its higher price point, and you also get the Mercedes-Benz brand name. The drawback of this vehicle is the really cramped third row seat. You really only want to do it if you absolutely need to have a third row seat, but you don't need it all that often, or you only need it for small kids. There's a reason the GLB doesn't really have that many competitors with 3-row seating. The Land Rover Discovery Sport offers it, but it's a little bigger. Other than that, mostly nothing else in this class has it, and it's because it's so tight to pack it back there. But I do think there are people who this vehicle will appeal to. I find the GLB more appealing than the GLA. I prefer the interior room, even if you don't get the third row, and I like the styling better, and it's not that much more money. So at the very least, it's a good entry level, even if you don't end up with the third row seat. And so that's the GLB. I'm not sure if Mercedes-Benz really needed another SUV, since this makes 8, but it does make more sense than several of the others. It's an entry-level family SUV with 3-row seating designed to get shoppers into the Mercedes-Benz family earlier than ever before. And it's a pretty good vehicle if you're into that sort of thing. Anyway, now it's time to give the GLB a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the GLB is fine, to mean nothing more, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration to 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds, which gets it a 2 out of 10. Handling is normal for this segment, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is obviously pretty low. The GLB is a fairly docile small family crossover, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Cool factor is low. This isn't very cool, nor is it intended to be, and it gets a 3 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 16 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The GLB is fine, but not overly well equipped, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is normal for this segment, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is pretty good, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is better than average for a vehicle this size thanks to the third row seat, even though it's cramped, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, value, and I think this is a bargain given the interior space, not counting the third row, plus the tech, plus the quality, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 35 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 51 out of 100, which places it here against small crossover and small Mercedes rivals. To me, the GLB lags behind the new Volvo XC40, the new Range Rover Evoque, and the new Mercedes GLC, but all of those models are more expensive than the GLB. If you want a luxury crossover on a budget with family capabilities, the GLB is a good option. And now it's time to climb out of the third row, and I've never been more nervous about anything in my life. Oh boy. Well, I'm stuck. I am now part of the Mercedes-Benz GLB. Oh.